Venice, 104. A Byzantine noblewoman named Maria Argyropoulina arrives to marry into the family of the Doge, carrying a small case of golden forks, an object almost never used for personal eating in Western Europe at the time. At her own wedding feast, she uses one instead of her fingers. What happened in that room isn't documented in detail, but Maria's custom would later become the target of moral criticism that outlived her by centuries. But to understand why a fork could cause a scandal at all, you have to go back further than Venice. Forks themselves were nothing new. For well over 1,000 years before this wedding, large two-pronged forks had existed across the ancient world, in Egypt, in Greece, in Rome, but they were kitchen tools, something used to hold meat steady while it was carved or roasted over a fire. Nobody used a small one to lift food to their own mouth. That idea, the personal eating fork, belonged to a different world entirely, the Byzantine East. In Constantinople, by the time of Maria's marriage, owning a small personal fork, often in gold or silver, had become an established mark of refinement among the wealthy. It wasn't exotic there. It was simply good manners, a sign that you belonged to a civilization sophisticated enough to have moved past eating with bare hands. When Maria carried that custom west to Venice, she wasn't trying to shock anyone. She was doing what any well-mannered Byzantine noblewoman would do at her own wedding. Decades later, a churchman named Peter Damian, writing not as an eyewitness, but as a moralist reflecting on her life after the fact, held Maria up as an example of vanity. In a text intended to instruct nuns on proper humility, Damian condemned her taste for luxury, her perfumes, her elaborate bathing habits, and her golden fork, which he framed as an unnatural rejection of the fingers God had given her. This wasn't a formal church ruling. Damian wasn't declaring official doctrine on behalf of Christendom. He was one influential writer, using one wealthy woman's habits as a cautionary tale about pride. Years after her wedding, Maria died, along with her husband and infant son, when plague swept through the region, as it did periodically in that era, killing indiscriminately. Damian, writing about her death afterward, framed it as divine judgment on her vanity. That was his interpretation. It was not a medical explanation, and it was very much a specific man's moral argument, not a documented fact about cause and effect. Damian's writing is one of the earliest documented examples of the fork being framed as a moral failing. It wasn't the only reason resistance to the object persisted. Over the centuries that followed, the fork would be treated as foreign, unmanly, unnecessarily delicate, or simply unfamiliar, depending on where and when you asked. But Damian's account shows, in writing, just how early and how personal that resistance could get. Across much of Western Europe, adoption remained uneven, for reasons that shifted depending on where you were. In Italy, the fork's fortunes actually improved with something entirely unrelated to morality: pasta. Long, slippery strands of it were genuinely difficult to eat gracefully with just a knife or fingers. By the 14th century, forks had become common enough in parts of Italy that owning one no longer marked you as scandalous, just Italian. 600 years after Maria's wedding, an English traveler named Thomas Coriat arrived in Italy and encountered the custom for himself. In 1608, he watched Italians eating with small forks and was impressed enough to adopt the habit personally. When he returned home to England and published an account of his travels in 1611, he described the practice approvingly, explaining that Italians disliked touching food with fingers that weren't perfectly clean. He was mocked by members of his own literary circle, including the playwright Ben Jonson and the poet John Donne, who found the habit ridiculous. They gave him a nickname that stuck, Furcifer, a pun. In Latin it meant, literally, fork bearer. It also meant something closer to rascal, or gallows bird. 6 centuries after a Byzantine princess was condemned for vanity, an Englishman was being laughed at for the exact same object, not as a moral failing this time, but as foreign, foppish, unnecessarily delicate. Even in France, where the fork had a longer head start, full acceptance wasn't automatic. Despite growing familiarity with the utensil at the French court through the 16th and 17th centuries, King Louis XIV, arguably the most powerful monarch in Europe at the time, reportedly continued eating with his own hands for most of his reign. Elite familiarity, it turned out, was not the same thing as elite acceptance. Part of the problem, frankly, was the fork itself. Early versions had only two straight tines, well suited to spearing a solid piece of meat, but far less practical for anything smaller. Peas rolled straight through the gap, sauces slid off. Using one gracefully took real practice skill, which meant clumsy attempts in public were their own form of embarrassment, stigma or no stigma. Over the 17th and 18th centuries, craftsmen across Europe gradually solved this. A third tine appeared, then a fourth, and the tines themselves curved slightly, turning the fork from a spearing tool into something that could actually scoop. Nobody can point to a single inventor. It was incremental, practical refinement, repeated in workshops across the continent. By the 18th century, something had genuinely shifted, and not only because of religion or fashion or clever design. European manners themselves were changing. A growing emphasis on refinement and cleanliness at the table made eating with bare, greasy fingers feel increasingly common and unsophisticated, exactly the opposite of how it had once seemed to fork users. Etiquette manuals began treating the fork's absence, not its presence, as the real social failure. Then industry finished the job. As the 19th century brought cheaper, mass-produced metalware, what had once been a rare, hand-forged luxury item became something nearly any household could own multiples of. From foreign vanity to moral failing to mockable affectation, the fork's meaning kept shifting, until, finally, it became the bare minimum expected of anyone eating at a table. If stories like this are the kind of thing you enjoy digging into, it's worth subscribing. There's a new one like it most weeks. Because here's the strange part, if you actually sit with it. Somewhere in the historical record, there is still a churchman's written judgment connecting a woman's death to her use of a fork. There is still a playwright's joke about a man being mocked for eating like an Italian. Neither of them could have imagined that the simple act of eating with a small pronged tool, once a mark of vanity, once a foreign affectation, once a joke, would end up completely unremarkable, in a drawer in nearly every kitchen on Earth. You'll probably use one today. You won't think about Venice, or Peter Damian, or a Somerset traveler nicknamed Furcifer. That's not a failure of memory. That's what it actually looks like when an object spends centuries moving through luxury, vanity, foreignness, ridicule, and refinement, and finally lands, without ceremony, on total normality. Take a look around. History is everywhere, even in the drawer next to your sink.